Welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Today we welcome back Jason Belzer, the CEO of Student Athlete NIL, also called SANIL, a company that is leading the field in athletes leveraging their NIL opportunities. Jason launched the Student Athlete NIL Summit in Atlanta in 2023, attracting over 500 athletes to the event. Today, his company supports over 1,500 athletes in managing their NIL contracts and transactions. Jason is at the forefront of navigating the evolution of this still very young industry. This conversation is a great opportunity for presidents to look around the corner and see what's next. Hey, Jason, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me back, Karen.
We got some really important things to talk about today. So let's first give our listeners a lay of the land for NIL in March 2024. Where are we and where are we going?
It's a great question, Karen. Your guess is as good as mine, to be honest with you, with how quickly things are moving in this space. Obviously, there's been a lot of evolution over the last 2.5 years. And I think we're going to see, we're only at the first lap of a mile-long race on how this is all going to shake itself out. I think number one, what we've seen is continuing consolidation in the industry. There was a lot of companies that were launched around NIL early on, and some of them no longer exist. Some of them are hanging on by a thread. And then the same concept with collectives. We saw lots of different collectives pop up, and now there's, again, a lot of consolidation. Our organization, Student Athlete NIL, now runs more than 50 different collectives across the country. And I expect that we will continue to roll up, at least on the mid-major side, the vast majority of schools. One of the reasons behind that is because most smaller institutions just don't have the resources, and it doesn't have there's just not enough money to make sense for independent collectives to exist. But we are having lots of conversations with big schools as well to try to bring as many of them under our umbrella as possible. What we're going to see over the next 6 to 18 months is more and more movement towards some sort of revenue share. We are going to have collective bargaining. The process of collective bargaining is going to happen when there is an entity, whether it is SANIL or somebody else, that comes together and has enough athletes under their umbrella to be able to start having serious conversations about what things look like. I sometimes jokingly say that if SANIL worked with everybody, there would be less Wild West, and there would be a lot of solutions done here, because all of our contracts are uniform. So Charlie Baker talks about the necessity of a uniform contract. That's something that we already have. We have 1,500 plus athletes that are under uniform contracts. We have tens of thousands of athletes in our ecosystem. We're sharing data between our schools. All of that information is being able to help everyone from that perspective. But then again, you still have a lot of entities that are vying for credibility, that are vying for relevancy and survival in this industry. And that includes independent collectives and anyone else that has been able to kind of stick their foot into the door of college athletics and is now trying to figure out how they're going to survive moving forward. So we see more and more revenue share. NIL is already revenue share by another name. 80% of the money that we deploy is donor money that has been either donor money or some sort of quote unquote other institutional money that has been diverted to name, image, and likeness in the form of roster payments. And so that's just going to increase. We saw the announcement, at least around the NIL tournament that's going to be happening in Vegas this year. We have a number of institutions that we have that are participating in that. We are having conversations with bowl games about doing revenue distribution. We're having conversations with conferences about revenue distribution around media rights to student athletes. So that's essentially the evolution of where this is headed. And it is unlikely that you're going to need 1,000 different entities managing all of this process, there's going to be a handful of survivors, just like there is in any industry. There's a lot of companies that come forward, and then there's ones that don't really exist. I teach organizational strategy at Rutgers, and I use an example of the automotive industry as a great example of what NIL is. There were hundreds of car companies around in the early 20th century. Now there are only a few dozen, right? And what's interesting is the last car company to have been started in the United States and actually become viable in the last 100 years is Tesla. And so it's unlikely that 5-10 years from now, we're sitting here and there's, 300 independent collectives and 17 different marketplaces. That's not going to be the case.
So that leads me to a couple questions. Number one, we're seeing market consolidation. That's typical in our society. Would you then be, let's say you're the program that lands on top or near the top. Would you then negotiate it all with the NCAA or its schools? Or how do you explain how that go-between works?
Yeah, so if you're asking me what my best case scenario is for college athletics, is that there won't need to be a lot of negotiation.
Okay.
At least that's what I would like.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that let's just make an assumption that if SANIL, has every school under contract. Well, then we know how much every athlete is already making, which we already know a lot about because we have all of this data. And so if I can go and let's just make this up and say that, well, this is true. The average SEC collective this year for football will be in the $9 to $10 million range, average. So if you just do the simple math, that means that every single athlete on that roster is receiving an average of about $100,000 to $110,000. So in that scenario, it's very easy to be able to go to the SEC and say, hey, let's do revenue share. We know that the current average is about this. So let's go and make that the base for your revenue, right? And that's part of the conversation is like, how much do every athlete get paid? Yeah. Well, in the NFL or the NBA, you're at about a 50% split, right? It's 48 to 52, somewhere in that space. It's not going to be that in college athletics unless we just allow unions to form and random negotiations to happen. It's going to be some percentage that's likely between 10 to 20% of the revenue. So the opportunity here is to say, you don't want too much negotiation. You want to be able to come in and say, this is what market rate is. This is what's reasonable. Here are all the various things that the student athletes should be getting. They should be getting guaranteed scholarships, which NCAA is doing. They should be getting guaranteed medical care. They should, not have to work or not have to practice X number of hours a week, whatever that is, right? The framework is there already. It doesn't have to be overly complex. Right. It's not like we're going to have lockouts, because if that happens, then it's disaster, right? It's a big disaster. And so the optimal scenario is that we have this in place. And look, I can tell you earlier today, I was on a conference call with a commissioner of an FBS league, talking to them about how do we try to get as many of their schools to be working with SANIL, if only for the sake of making sure that we're on the same page, that everybody has insight over what's happening. And then also that, because we are now working on a couple of league-wide type revenue opportunities for student athletes, to be able to create a scenario in which the league can be in more control of that. And that's essentially what's going to happen. I'll just use as an example, like, the Sun Belt, which is, one of the smaller FCS leagues compared to the SEC, is going to have a different type of opportunity for their student athletes. But if the SEC ends up giving up 10% of their revenue to the athletes, you would think that the Sun Belt would probably be beholden to doing something similar. But nothing says that it has to be that way either. Right. Every school and every level is going to be different, but eventually you're gonna have a movement towards the middle where everyone finds some common ground.
Okay, so I'm a conference commissioner. So you're heading in the direction of I'm assuming you have conferences under SANIL now, and you're sharing data with the conference amongst.
So we have many schools that are in the same conference. So the type
Okay,
of data that we share, is
okay,
we share information as it relates to this is what we know other peers in your conference are doing on an average basis or median basis. But we also do things like net ranking. So like for basketball right now, if you are let's just take an example of like Indiana State or Utah State or Grand Canyon. All three schools have had great seasons so far that we're working with. We will go and say, this is what the average school in the Mountain West or the Missouri Valley or the WAC is spending. But this is also what schools with similar nets are spending so that you can have an idea of what this looks like. No different than what we did in football, which is to say, this is what a power four football player is making. And football is a little bit different than basketball because football is far more positional based, meaning like quarterbacks go for X. In basketball, it's not like, well, the most valued position is the point guard. It's more of like the numbers are more average across the roster
yeah, yeah,
because it's a smaller roster. So
sure,
I can
sure,
tell you right now that the median P4 or P5, the Big East, not the Pac-12, going in for basketball next year, the median collective pool will be over $1.5 million for basketball. There will be probably 10 schools that are paying more than $2.5 to $3 million. So it's not rocket science to do the math and say that the average player on that team will make about $175,000.
okay,
But a Zach Edey from Purdue makes more than $1 million a year in NIL. It's not like the center position is somehow substantially more valued than the point guard. That we actually haven't looked at the data, but it's not like the difference between a quarterback and a defensive tackle. That's where you can see a pretty distinct difference. Like I can tell you that there is no quarterback on the FBS level, which is about 130 schools, that is worth anything less than at least $100,000.
okay, okay. All right, so that's what, one of the things that the NCAA has been hankering for is this idea of at least knowing if the numbers match up, like what is this school getting for this quarterback, what is this school? So you're offering that stability in your situation, which is what it seems everybody would be happy with, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and we talked about that interview that I did with President Baker. One of the things that got cut out of that interview was that I had mentioned the numbers, and he had said that they had heard a lot of numbers, but they weren't really sure if it was true or not.
Yeah.
And I said, well, the short answer, it is true because we know what the rosters look like. And so that is information that the NCAA needs. The assumption is that they will get that information, hopefully, with this new clearinghouse and TPA and all of that, assuming that all comes to fruition.
All
And
right.
we have offered to them to be able to provide that information.
Okay.
They want to take it from us.
Okay. So I'm a fan of the Temple Owls here in Philadelphia, and I want to start a collective, and I want to partner with you. How does that process work?
Yeah, so the short answer is that we would not work with just an individual that wants to start a collective unless the university says that they want us to be there. So we've kind of passed that point now of just partnering with random people. We only come into a scenario in which the university distinctly says that we want to work and want SANIL to come in and launch a collective. So like I've had conversations with Temple many a times, and they have sort of said that they really haven't embraced it. They sort of were interested initially, and then they've sort of said, we're not interested in this. And so, or at least by their actions. But that's essentially what's happening. Literally every day we're getting inbound from more and more schools, and we're beginning to get more and more inbound from P4 saying our collectives need help because they're falling behind or they're too donor dependent, and we don't know how to make sure that this is something that's long-term sustainable for us.
Okay, okay, that's good. Now, who manages the finances of the collective under your structure? Does that come through you and your office? Does that come through the collectives? How does that work?
Yeah, so we manage everything. So we are a full service. So it's sort of important to think of SANIL as a master organization, and all of our collectives are sort of franchises.
Okay.
And so all of the accounting, the finance, the back end work, the legal, all of that is done centrally through us.
Okay.
So all of our collectives have a view of what's happening within the collective at any given time, how much money has come in, what's projected, all of those different things. They're supposed to be an independent business. And that's also why we have economies of scale. We're built on, we've built our back end on Salesforce and NetSuite. These are like industrial platforms. So it's not just somebody sitting with QuickBooks trying to put together, a contract. And that's one of the efficiencies that we can provide people that they can't. So just as an example, even now, the way that our contracts are structured, if a student athlete at a school goes into the portal, we can cancel those contracts. We've done so to ensure that we have flexibility to be able to achieve that.
Okay. What about taxes? Taxes for the athletes, taxes for the donors. How does that work?
Yeah, so as it relates to the athletes, we do not take taxes out because they're independent contractors, and we want to ensure that it's very clear that they're independent contractors. We certainly have conversations with them. We can give them estimated numbers on what their tax burdens are. We can backload those contracts so more money comes in at the spring so they can pay those. So that's that piece. As it relates to the donors or the contributors, unless somebody is giving money through their business, they are not receiving an individualized tax deduction on their contract. We do not do that. We don't believe in it. There are other entities, including independent collectives, that run nonprofits. I have been pretty vocal that I'm adamantly opposed to that. And quite frankly, it's just college athletics playing with fire, because many people believe most college athletic departments shouldn't be tax-free entities. And so, these collectives are continuing to do that, but that's not something that we're willing to go pursue.
Yeah, I think it's one of those areas that has yet really been to explore. I know there were some rumblings about it in the Oregon Title IX lawsuit that said that perhaps there was some exposure there, but it seems like it's a very untrodden landscape. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and until the FBI or the IRS come in and say something, people
Yeah.
will continue to push the needle.
Right, right, all right. Um, Anything else that you want my listeners to understand about the current landscape for what the goal is for SANIL, what the status is for NILs and collectives before we go into agents?
Yeah, I would just reemphasize that we are trying to push for uniformity, and we are also trying to push for uh financial independence of the collectives. We believe that there's a way to be able to create self-generating revenue units that are not totally dependent. And there's so much money out there that we can figure out how to make the pie bigger. And if we do that, then at least that it creates a scenario where hopefully we can make sure that non-revenue sports, including women's sports, don't have to get destroyed. And we're feverishly trying to work towards a solution that does not include pure employment, because employment for college athletics would be devastating outside of those, few revenue sports that are actually making real money.
Yeah, no question, no question. All right, so let's venture into the world of agents. You said you deal with a lot of them. Tell us about what they do, how they operate, that type of thing.
Yeah, so there was a lot of agents before NIL, and now that has gone up, you know, fivefold. And we actually did a quick kind of study looking at the people that represent the student athletes that we work with across our 50 schools. And we just basically said, all right, let's go just do a random cross check of how many of these agents, representatives are registered in the states in which they are representing athletes under the Uniform Athlete Agent Act. And I think it was like 23%. So 77% of them were not even registered. I'm not talking about with like a players association. I'm simply saying registered with the state. You have a select group of agents, the CAAs and Excels, those are legitimate agencies. But now everybody and their mother can be an NIL agent. And so they're just going in and representing kids. They're selling kids all these big ideas and all of these different things, but they don't even bother to go register in the state because it costs them money.
Yeah.
And so it's scary. It's scary because you have kids giving kids advice that they have no business giving. There's no regulation. The NCAA is not involved in that regulatory process. And so it's certain that student athletes are being taken advantage of and or don't even realize that they're getting bad advice that'll come back to bite them in the ass later on.
Right, right. So agents, no standardized contracts, no registration. Athletes might know what they're signing, but they might not know what they're signing. Parents have ideas. So how do we make sense of this? How again, standardized and
I mean, the simplest form is that the reality is that, and this is coming from somebody that has done more NIL deals than anybody else. 99% of kids do not need an agent.
Yeah.
Because 99% of kids don't have more than 4 figures in actual NIL value. If you're a student athlete that's going to sign an NIL deal, especially with the collective, just hire a lawyer, pay them an hourly rate. At least you know that they're competent, that they're licensed to be able to look at your contract. Do not let a non-attorney do your contract because it's not going to help you and it's going to hurt you more likely than not. And the reality is that there's no agent that's going to get you more money out of a collective than somebody else. That's nonsense. We do contracts, we don't negotiate. Like, this is what we offer, that's what you're taking, and you sure can sign everything else in the contract or you cannot sign anything in the contract. You know what I mean? So a lawyer is the right way to go in this situation, and pay them by the hour, and they shouldn't have to do more than an hour worth of work for you in those types of situations.
So some people might wonder that the transfer portal may or may not play a role in this. Talk us through how it works from both an NIL perspective and a contract perspective.
Yeah, of course the transfer portal plays a huge role because there's all these student athletes that are going into the transfer portal thinking they're going to get paid,
Right.
when in reality, it's like a game of musical chairs, but there are a lot less chairs available than kids think there are.
Yeah.
So most student athletes, even now, like we have scenarios where student athlete goes into the portal, we cancel the contract, they come back to us and say, well, why did you cancel the contract? Well, the short answer is that you as an athlete have no value to the collective anymore, because if you're transferring to California and you were playing basketball in New York, what am I going to do with your assets? Right? What am I going to be able to do to sell to a brand in New York when you're out in California? There's no value from that perspective. So number one, they're like, oh, well, what if I don't get a better offer from somebody? Well, that's not my problem. That's a decision that you made. I mean, it's no different than you quitting your job without having another job available to you and then saying, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have given up my actual paycheck before I decided to go into the free market. So I understand if a student athlete, and there's tampering happening everywhere. So quite frankly, if a student athlete has a genuine offer from somebody else, then okay, that's one thing. But don't be surprised if you go in the portal and you get nothing or get less than what you thought you were worth and get stuck having to take something. And that's honestly just a hard lesson that a lot of kids are learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Yes. So last question, and maybe you can help me frame this. I'm working on a chapter right now on the business of college sports. And I'm thinking that the chapter ought to include the business of college athletes. What do you think about that? And what should I include?
That's a great question. I absolutely think that there's value into having that conversation. I think there's value into just even explaining NIL versus synthetic NIL and roster value. Because the reality is that the business of college athletes is going to be very, very, very different than the business of college sports.
Yeah.
And it's an emerging sector and something that certainly is creating a lot of opportunity. But it would be good to be the first one to really discuss those things. And certainly you would want to have as much accurate data and information as you can for that. But just being able to talk about the landscape of what is close to $1 billion industry that has come over in the last 3 years and is only going to increase with revenue share and other things.
That's a great idea. It's a great idea. Jason, thank you so much for providing my listeners and me insight as usual. You're really spot on.
I appreciate it, Karen. I look forward to reconnecting again in 6 months and things being completely different again.
Sounds good.